In the silence before memory, where desert winds carry whispers of forgotten kings, there lies a story buried beneath layers of time and sand. Along the banks of the ancient Euphrates, where water once sang its eternal song to clay walls and marble palaces, the ghost of a great city still walks the twilight. Mari, her name itself a melody lost to ages, once stood as the jewel of Mesopotamia, her towers reaching toward stars that have watched empires rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore. Here, beneath the weight of millennia, sleep the dreams of merchants and monarchs, the laughter of children in courtyards now claimed by dust, and the prayers of priests whose temples have returned to earth. Tonight, let the wind carry you back across 4,000 years to witness the birth of a civilization that dared to build paradise beside the flowing water, only to watch it slip away like sand through mortal fingers. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The Euphrates had been flowing for countless ages before the first human foot touched its muddy banks, carrying within its waters the promise of life and the whisper of civilizations yet unborn. In the third millennium before the Common Era, when the world was younger and the stars seemed closer to the earth, the great river curved through the Syrian steppe like a silver serpent, depositing its rich sediments across the fertile plains. It was here, at a strategic bend where the water slowed and deepened, that destiny would plant the seeds of Mari. The landscape spoke in the language of possibility. Rolling hills crowned with sparse vegetation overlooked the river valley, where palm trees cast shadows across fields that begged for cultivation. The climate was kinder then, blessed with rains that came in their season, and winds that carried moisture rather than dust. This was a place where nomadic tribes might pause in their wanderings, where the restless might find reason to settle, where the river's abundance could transform wanderers into builders of cities. Archaeological whispers suggest that the earliest inhabitants arrived around 2900 BCE, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had guided countless generations of Mesopotamian peoples to establish their homes beside flowing water. These first settlers were not grand architects or mighty warriors, but ordinary humans possessed of extraordinary vision. They recognized in this bend of the Euphrates something that their ancestors had sought across countless migrations. A place where the earth and water conspired to support human dreams. The initial settlement was humble, consisting of reed huts and simple mud brick structures that rose like brown flowers from the riverside plain. The settlers organized themselves according to the ancient patterns of Mesopotamian life, establishing neighborhoods based on kinship and profession. Near the water's edge, fishermen built their homes and workshops, their nets drying in the morning sun while children played among the bulrushes. Slightly inland, farmers constructed granaries and workshops, their eyes always turned toward the fields that would provide their sustenance. What distinguished Mari from its contemporaries was not its size or sophistication, but its position. The city sat at the intersection of ancient trade routes that connected the resource-rich mountains of Anatolia with the wealthy cities of southern Mesopotamia. Caravans travelling between Assyria and the Mediterranean coast found Mari a natural stopping point, a place to rest their animals, repair their equipment, and conduct the business that drove the ancient world's economy. The river itself served as both highway and guardian. Boats laden with goods from Babylon could navigate upstream to Mari's growing harbour, while downstream vessels carried Mari's products toward the Persian Gulf and beyond. The Euphrates provided more than transportation, it offered protection. Enemy armies approaching from the east or west would find their advance complicated by the need to cross or circumnavigate the river, giving Mari's defenders precious time to prepare. As decades passed into centuries, the settlement began to assume the characteristics of a true city. The random scatter of early habitations gave way to planned neighborhoods connected by streets that followed logical patterns. Public buildings appeared, temples to honor the gods who blessed their endeavors, workshops where craftsmen pursued their trades, and administrative centers where the increasingly complex business of governing a growing population could be conducted. The religious life of early Mary centered around the worship of deities common throughout Mesopotamia, but with local variations that reflected the city's unique character and position. Dagon, the god of grain and fertility, received particular veneration, his temple becoming a focal point for agricultural festivals that celebrated the river's annual floods and the harvest they made possible. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, also commanded significant devotion, her dual nature reflecting Mari's own character as both a peaceful trading center and a militarily strategic position. The Temple of Dagon, constructed during these early centuries, exemplified the architectural ambitions of Mari's growing population. Built from locally produced bricks and decorated with intricate carved reliefs, the temple rose in a series of terraced levels that symbolized the connection between earth and heaven. Within its walls, priests maintained the sacred fires and conducted the rituals that assured divine protection for the city and its inhabitants. The temple also served practical functions, acting as a center for the collection and distribution of grain, a repository for legal documents, and a meeting place for the city's leading citizens. Economic activity flourished as Mari's reputation spread throughout the region. The city became renowned for its skilled craftsmen, whose products, textiles, metalwork, pottery, and carved goods, found markets throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. The famous Mari textiles, woven from wool provided by flocks grazing in the surrounding steppes, became particularly prized for their quality and distinctive patterns. These textiles, along with grain from the fertile fields and metalwork crafted by skilled artisans, formed the foundation of Mari's growing wealth. As Mari's influence expanded throughout the Middle Euphrates region, the city's governance evolved from the informal leadership of tribal elders to a more sophisticated system suited to managing a complex urban society. The emergence of the institution known as the Shakanakyu marked a crucial transition in Mari's political development, establishing a form of rule that would persist for centuries and leave an indelible mark on the city's character. The term Shakanakyu, derived from the Akkadian language that served as the diplomatic tongue of ancient Mesopotamia, translates roughly as governor or military commander, but these simple translations fail to capture the full complexity of the position. The Shakanakyu of Mari combined military, religious, and administrative authority in a single office, serving simultaneously as the city's supreme commander, chief priest, and ultimate judicial authority. This concentration of power reflected the practical necessities of governing a strategically important city in an era when military threats, religious obligations, and administrative challenges were inextricably intertwined. The earliest Shakanakus ruled during the 24th and 23rd centuries BCE, a period when Mari was establishing itself as the dominant power in the Middle Euphrates Valley. These rulers, whose names echo through history with the weight of ancient authority, Ikun Mari, Iku Shamash, and their successors, faced the monumental task of transforming a prosperous trading city into the capital of a regional kingdom. Ikun Mari, whose name means he established Mari, embodied the ambitious spirit of his age. Under his leadership, the city undertook massive construction projects that would define its physical character for centuries to come. The Great Palace Complex, which would eventually become one of the largest and most sophisticated administrative centres in the ancient world, began as a modest residence and administrative building during Ikunmari's reign. The palace's initial design reflected both practical needs and symbolic aspirations. It served as the Shakanaku's residence, the seat of government, and a physical manifestation of Mari's growing power and wealth. The construction of the palace required unprecedented cooperation among Mari's citizens and represented a massive investment of the city's resources. Thousands of workers laboured to quarry stone, manufacture bricks, and transport materials from across the region. Skilled craftsmen were recruited from throughout Mesopotamia to execute the intricate decorative schemes that would adorn the palace walls. The project consumed decades and enormous quantities of grain, metal, textiles, and other resources, but it established Mari as a city capable of monumental achievements. Military expansion accompanied architectural ambition as the Shakanakus extended Mari's influence throughout the middle Euphrates valley. The city's armies, equipped with bronze weapons and organized according to Mesopotamian military practices, campaigned against neighboring settlements and nomadic tribes, establishing a network of tributary relationships that brought wealth and security to Mari. The Shakanakus proved skilled diplomats as well as warriors, negotiating alliances with distant powers while maintaining their city's independence and autonomy. Trade flourished under the protection of Mari's growing military power. Merchants from the city established commercial outposts along the major trade routes, creating a network of economic relationships that extended from the Anatolian highlands to the Persian Gulf. Mari's strategic position allowed its rulers to levy taxes and fees on passing caravans, generating revenue that funded further military and architectural projects. The city became a crucial link in the commercial chains that connected the various regions of the ancient Near East, and its prosperity attracted merchants, craftsmen, and scholars from across the known world. The religious dimensions of Shakanaku rule reflected the deep spiritual beliefs that permeated ancient Mesopotamian society. The rulers served as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, responsible for maintaining the proper relationships between Mari's citizens and the gods who protected their city. This religious authority manifested in elaborate ceremonies and festivals that punctuated the calendar year, bringing the community together in collective worship and celebration. The most significant of these festivals honoured Dagon, the god of fertility and abundance whose blessing was essential for Mari's agricultural prosperity. During the spring festival that celebrated the river's annual flood, the Shakanaku would lead processions through the city streets, offering sacrifices and prayers on behalf of all Mari's inhabitants. These ceremonies reinforced the ruler's spiritual authority while providing opportunities for the community to affirm its collective identity and shared values. Administrative innovation accompanied religious and military developments as the Shakanakis created sophisticated systems for managing their expanding realm. Scribes trained in the Cuneiform writing system maintained detailed records of government activities, commercial transactions, and legal proceedings. These archives, discovered by archaeologists millennia later, provide unprecedented insight into the daily life and governance of an ancient Mesopotamian city. The legal system developed under the Shakanakus reflected both local traditions and broader Mesopotamian practices. Courts presided over by appointed judges resolved disputes according to established precedents and royal decrees. The Shakanakus themselves served as final arbiters in cases involving the most serious crimes or disputes between prominent citizens. This legal framework provided stability and predictability that encouraged commerce and craftsmanship while maintaining social order in an increasingly complex urban society. The spiritual heart of Mari beat strongest within the walls of its magnificent temples, structures that rose from the riverside plain like prayers made manifest in stone and brick. These sacred buildings, constructed over generations with meticulous care and boundless devotion, represented more than mere architectural achievements. They embodied the deepest beliefs and aspirations of a civilization that understood itself to be living in constant dialogue with the divine realm. The great temple of Dagon, patron deity of Mari, dominated the city's sacred precinct with a majesty that spoke of both earthly prosperity and heavenly protection. Built and rebuilt over centuries, the temple evolved from a modest shrine into a complex of buildings that encompassed courtyards, administrative chambers, workshops, and residential quarters for the priestly hierarchy. The temple's central ziggurat, rising in measured steps toward the sky, served as both a symbolic mountain connecting earth to heaven and a practical beacon visible to travellers approaching Mari from across the surrounding plains. The ziggurat's construction represented one of the most ambitious engineering projects undertaken in the ancient Near East during the 3rd millennium BCE. Each level was carefully planned and executed according to mathematical principles that reflected Mesopotamian understanding of sacred geometry. The bricks used in construction were manufactured according to precise specifications, with each bearing the impression of royal seals that proclaim the divine authority under which the work proceeded. Ramps and staircases provided access to the upper levels, where the most sacred rituals took place in chambers accessible only to the highest-ranking priests and the Shakanaku himself. The temple complex served multiple functions that reflected the integrated nature of religious, economic, and social life in ancient Mari. Beyond its primary role as a centre of worship, the temple operated as a major economic institution, controlling vast agricultural holdings and managing extensive livestock herds. Priests and temple servants cultivated temple lands using advanced irrigation techniques, generating surpluses that supported not only the religious establishment, but also the wider community during times of scarcity. The temple workshops produced goods for both religious and commercial purposes. Skilled craftsmen working under priestly supervision created the elaborate ritual objects required for temple ceremonies: golden vessels for libations, silver implements for sacrificial rituals, and intricately carved stone reliefs depicting scenes from religious mythology. These same workshops also produced trade goods that generated revenue for temple operations: textiles woven from temple flocks' wool, pottery crafted from clay found along the Euphrates banks, and metal objects forged from bronze and precious metals acquired through commercial networks. The priesthood of Dagon constituted a learned class whose influence extended far beyond purely religious matters. These men and women, trained in the complex rituals required to maintain proper relationships with the divine realm, also served as scribes, teachers, astronomers, and advisors to the Shakanakus. The temple schools where priests received their education became centers of learning that preserved and transmitted the accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization, mathematical techniques, astronomical observations, medical practices, and literary traditions. The daily rhythm of temple life reflected the cosmic order that ancient Mesopotamians believed governed all existence. Dawn brought the morning sacrifice, when priests offered bread, beer, and meat to Dagon, while chanting prayers that ensured the gods' continued protection of Mari and its people. Throughout the day, various ceremonies marked the passage of time, rituals to ensure successful harvests, prayers for the health of the royal family, and offerings to guarantee favourable outcomes for commercial ventures. Evening ceremonies concluded the daily cycle, with rituals that prepared the divine realm for the mysteries of night. Priests would light sacred lamps whose flames would burn until dawn, symbolically maintaining the connection between human and divine realms during the dark hours when malevolent spirits were believed to be most active. These lamplighting ceremonies often attracted gatherings of citizens who sought divine blessing for their families and enterprises. The Temple of Ishtar, though smaller than Dagon's shrine, commanded equal reverence among Mari's population. Dedicated to the goddess of love and warfare, this temple reflected the dual nature of human existence in the ancient world, where the forces of creation and destruction were understood to be inextricably linked. The temple's architecture embodied this duality, with peaceful gardens and courtyards adjoining chambers dedicated to military rituals and ceremonies honouring fallen warriors. Ishtar's priestesses, who included women from prominent Maori families, maintained specialised knowledge of healing arts, childbirth practices, and the rituals surrounding marriage and family life. The goddess's temple served as a centre for activities related to women's roles in Maori society, hosting ceremonies that celebrated important transitions in the female life cycle. The sacred marriage rituals performed in Ishtar's honour were believed to ensure the fertility of both the land and the people, connecting human relationships to the cosmic forces that governed natural cycles. The temple complex also included shrines dedicated to other members of the Mesopotamian pantheon, each serving specialized functions within the broader religious ecosystem. Shamash, the sun god and patron of justice, received worship in a temple that served as a center for legal proceedings and oath-taking. Merchants would swear sacred oaths before Shamash's altar before embarking on trading expeditions, while judges invoked the god's guidance when rendering verdicts in difficult cases. The architectural sophistication of Maori's temples reflected advances in engineering and construction techniques that positioned the city among the most advanced centres of ancient civilization. Temple builders developed innovative methods for creating strong foundations in the marshy ground near the Euphrates, using layers of stone, brick, and bitumen to create stable bases for massive structures. The walls incorporated drainage systems that prevented water damage, while ventilation shafts ensured air circulation within interior chambers. Decorative arts reached extraordinary heights in the temple complexes, where skilled artists created works that combined aesthetic beauty with religious significance. Wall paintings depicted scenes from mythological narratives, while carved stone reliefs illustrated the relationships between gods and humans. These artistic works served not only as decoration but also as educational tools, helping illiterate citizens understand complex religious concepts through visual narratives. In the bustling markets of Mari, where the sound of haggling voices mingled with the creak of heavily laden cartwheels and the braying of pack animals, the true genius of the city revealed itself. This was not merely a place of trade, but a sophisticated commercial hub that facilitated economic relationships spanning continents and connecting cultures separated by thousands of miles of desert, mountain, and sea. The merchants of Mari, through their enterprise and expertise, transformed their city into one of the ancient world's most important centres of international commerce. The geographic advantages that had first attracted settlers to Mari's location became even more pronounced as trade networks expanded throughout the ancient Near East. The city's position on the great bend of the Euphrates placed it at the intersection of multiple commercial arteries. The river route that connected Babylon with the Mediterranean coast, the overland path that linked Anatolia with the cities of southern Mesopotamia, and the caravan routes that brought exotic goods from the distant lands of India and Central Asia. Mari's merchants developed specialized expertise in managing the complex logistics of long-distance trade. They established commercial partnerships with colleagues in distant cities, creating networks of trust and mutual obligation that enabled goods to flow smoothly across political boundaries and cultural barriers. These partnerships, documented in thousands of cuneiform tablets discovered in Mari's archives, reveal the sophisticated business practices that underpinned ancient international commerce. The most successful Mari merchants operated on a scale that would impress modern entrepreneurs. They maintained warehouses in multiple cities, employed agents to represent their interests in foreign markets, and developed financial instruments that allowed them to extend credit and transfer funds across vast distances. Some merchants owned entire caravans, hundreds of donkeys and camels, dozens of professional traders and guards, and mobile workshops where goods could be repaired or modified to suit local preferences. Textiles formed the backbone of Mari's export economy, with the city's weavers producing fabrics that were prized throughout the ancient world for their quality and distinctive patterns. The production process began in the surrounding steppes, where nomadic tribes raised sheep and goats whose wool provided the raw material for Mari's textile industry. Skilled shepherds developed breeds that produced particularly fine wool, while sophisticated breeding programs ensured consistent quality across generations. The transformation of raw wool into finished textiles required the coordinated efforts of hundreds of specialized workers. Spinners converted wool into thread using techniques perfected over generations, while dyers created the brilliant colors that distinguished Mari textiles from their competitors. The dyeing process itself represented a significant technological achievement, with craftsmen developing formulas for producing stable, vibrant colors using materials obtained from across the known world: indigo from distant valleys, purple from Mediterranean sea snails, and red from insects harvested in mountainous regions. Weaving represented the pinnacle of Mari's textile arts, with master craftsmen creating fabrics whose complexity and beauty remain impressive even by modern standards. The most skilled weavers worked on vertical looms that allowed them to create large pieces suitable for royal garments and temple decorations. These artisans guarded their techniques jealously, passing their knowledge only to carefully selected apprentices who swore sacred oaths to maintain the secrets of their craft. The finished textiles were marketed throughout the ancient world using distribution networks that connected Mari to markets from Spain to India. Mari merchants established permanent representatives in major commercial centers, while traveling salesmen carried samples to smaller markets where potential customers could examine the quality and place orders for future delivery. The reputation of Mari textiles became so widespread that the city's name became synonymous with quality fabric throughout much of the ancient Near East. Metalworking represented another crucial component of Mari's commercial success. The city's craftsmen developed advanced techniques for working with bronze, creating both practical items and luxury goods that found ready markets among wealthy customers throughout Mesopotamia. Mari's metallurgists were particularly renowned for their ability to create complex bronze vessels decorated with intricate patterns and scenes from mythology and daily life. The bronze industry required sophisticated supply chains that brought raw materials from distant sources. Copper came from mines in Anatolia and Cyprus, while tin arrived from even more distant sources in Central Asia and possibly Europe. Mari's merchants negotiated complex arrangements with suppliers, often accepting payment in goods rather than precious metals, and developing long-term relationships that ensured steady supplies of essential materials. The city's workshops produced bronze items ranging from simple tools and weapons to elaborate ceremonial objects used in religious rituals and royal ceremonies. Master metalworkers developed specialized techniques for decorating bronze surfaces, including inlay work that incorporated precious metals and stones into complex designs. These decorated bronze objects became status symbols among the wealthy classes throughout Mesopotamia, with Mari's craftsmen receiving commissions from royal courts and temple establishments across the region. Agriculture provided the foundation for all of Mari's commercial activities, with the fertile fields surrounding the city producing surpluses that supported the urban population and provided trade goods for export. The agricultural system developed around sophisticated irrigation networks that channeled Euphrates water to fields located at varying distances from the river. Engineers designed and maintained canal systems that could distribute water evenly across thousands of acres, while preventing the salt accumulation that plagued many Mesopotamian agricultural regions. The most important crops included barley and wheat, which served both as dietary staples for Mari's population and as valuable trade commodities. Mari's grain was particularly prized in mountainous regions where local agricultural production was insufficient to support dense populations. The city's merchants developed specialized techniques for preserving and transporting grain, using sealed containers and careful storage methods that prevented spoilage during long journeys. Date cultivation represented a particularly successful adaptation to local environmental conditions, with Mari's farmers developing techniques for growing date palms in areas that received irrigation water. The dates produced in Mari's orchards were renowned for their size and sweetness, commanding premium prices in markets throughout Mesopotamia. Date cultivation also produced secondary benefits, as the palm trees provided shade for other crops while their leaves could be harvested for use in construction and basket making. The commercial success of Mari's agriculture depended on sophisticated systems for managing labour and organising production. Large agricultural estates employed hundreds of workers during peak seasons, while smaller family farms contributed to the overall agricultural output through cooperative arrangements that allowed for efficient use of irrigation water and shared labour during harvest periods. The palace and temple establishments maintained their own agricultural holdings, using the profits to fund their various activities while contributing to the overall food security of the city's population. Mari's commercial networks extended far beyond the simple exchange of goods to encompass the transfer of knowledge, technology, and cultural practices. Merchants returning from distant lands brought more than exotic products. They carried information about new techniques, foreign customs, and political developments that affected trade conditions. This constant flow of information made Mari a cosmopolitan centre where influences from across the known world converged and merged to create new forms of artistic expression and technological innovation. The city's markets became meeting places where people from diverse backgrounds encountered each other on terms of mutual benefit. Mesopotamian farmers sold their produce alongside Anatolian metallurgists, while Arabian merchants offered exotic spices and perfumes next to craftsmen from the Levantine coast, displaying their finest products. These encounters fostered cultural exchange that enriched Mari's civilization, while strengthening the commercial relationships that sustained the city's prosperity. As the 3rd millennium BCE drew to a close, Mari had established itself as one of the ancient world's premier commercial centres. The city's merchants had created trade networks that spanned continents, while its craftsmen had achieved technical mastery that was recognised throughout the civilised world. The wealth generated by commerce had funded the construction of magnificent temples and palaces, while supporting a population that enjoyed living standards unmatched by most contemporary societies. The stage was set for Mari to emerge as not merely a commercial centre, but as the capital of a powerful kingdom that would leave an indelible mark on the history of the ancient Near East. The methods and institutions developed during this formative period would serve Mari well in the challenges that lay ahead. The commercial networks that connected the city to distant markets would provide both wealth and political intelligence, while the skills developed in managing complex business relationships would prove invaluable in the diplomatic negotiations that characterized international relations in the ancient world. The merchants of Mari had created more than a successful economy. They'd established the foundation for their city's emergence as a major power in the complex political landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. As evening descended over the bustling markets, and the last caravans of the day disappeared into the growing darkness beyond the city gates, Mari settled into the peaceful rhythm that had characterized its existence for generations. The Euphrates continued its eternal flow past the city walls, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of a people who had dared to build something magnificent beside its waters. In the distance, the lights of the great temples flickered like stars brought down to earth, while in the palace complex the Shakanaku and his advisors planned for the challenges and opportunities that tomorrow would bring to their thriving city. Tirade routes became the veins through which Mari's lifeblood flowed, connecting distant lands through corridors of commerce that stretched like silver threads across the ancient world. The merchants who walked these paths carried more than goods in their leather satchels and wooden carts. They bore the dreams and ambitions of a city that had learned to speak the language of nations. In the cool hours before dawn, when the eastern horizon held only the promise of light, the gates of Mari would swing open to receive caravans that had travelled through the night. Dust-covered traders would emerge from the desert darkness, their camels' bells singing soft melodies that had accompanied them across hundreds of miles of shifting sand and starlit emptiness. These were the harbingers of Mari's growing influence, bearers of cedar wood from the Lebanese mountains, silver from Anatolia's hidden mines, and precious stones that had been polished by the hands of craftsmen in distant Harappa. The palace scribes, masters of the cuneiform script that had become the diplomatic tongue of the ancient world, worked by oil lamp light to record each transaction, each arrival, each departure. Their reed styluses moved with practiced precision across clay tablets, creating an archive of commerce that would one day serve as testimony to Mari's remarkable reach. In their careful script, the city's influence was measured not merely in gold or goods, but in the relationships that bound Mari to kingdoms both near and impossibly far. King Yadun-Lim, whose name would echo through the corridors of history like a prayer spoken in an empty temple, understood that true power lay not in the strength of walls alone, but in the invisible bonds of mutual benefit that connected one city to another. Under his reign, Mari became a nexus where the paths of empire converged, where Babylonian merchants met traders from the Indus Valley, where Egyptian gold changed hands with Mesopotamian grain. The royal workshops of Mari hummed with creative energy, their craftsmen developing techniques that would influence artistic traditions for centuries to come. In the bronze working quarters, smiths heated copper and tin in furnaces that glowed, Like captured stars, their hammers ringing out rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the city itself. The bronze they created was not merely functional, it was art given form, vessels and weapons that bore intricate designs, speaking of gods and heroes, of the eternal dance between order and chaos that defined the human experience. Mari's potters discovered new ways to work clay, creating vessels so thin they seemed to hold light rather than liquid, their surfaces painted with scenes that told stories of harvest festivals and royal ceremonies. These weren't mere containers but chronicles, each piece a page in the unwritten book of Mari's cultural flowering. When archaeologists would eventually uncover these artifacts, they would find in them a civilization that understood beauty as something essential to human existence, not merely decorative but fundamental to the expression of what it meant to be alive. Within the palace walls, gardens bloomed like islands of paradise carved from the harsh landscape of the middle Euphrates. These were not wild spaces but carefully cultivated dreams made manifest, where water flowed through channels lined with polished stone, where fruit trees cast shadows that provided refuge from the relentless sun. The royal gardeners, inheritors of knowledge passed down through generations of patient cultivation, understood that their work was more than agriculture. It was the creation of beauty in a world that often seemed determined to discourage such efforts. Queen Shibtu, whose wisdom complemented her husband's political acumen, walked these garden paths in the quiet hours of early morning, when dew still clung to rose petals and the air carried the scent of jasmine and bitter orange. Her presence transformed these spaces into something more than mere display. They became centers of learning where visiting dignitaries could experience Mari's sophistication not through military might or architectural grandeur alone, but through the subtle demonstration of a civilization that had time and resources to devote to the cultivation of beauty. The palace gardens contained plants gathered from across the known world, a living testament to Mari's extensive trade networks. Lebanese cedar saplings stood beside date palms from southern Mesopotamia, while herbs from the Iranian plateau grew alongside vegetables native to the Euphrates Valley. This botanical collection represented more than horticultural curiosity. It embodied Mari's role as a cultural crossroads, a place where the natural wealth of many lands could be brought together and made to flourish under careful stewardship. In the shade of pomegranate trees heavy with fruit, scribes would sometimes gather to practice their craft, their voices creating a gentle murmur as they recited the epic poems that were beginning to take shape in Mari's literary circles. These were the first stirrings of what would become a rich tradition of storytelling, narratives that wove together mythology, history, and moral instruction in ways that spoke to both the educated elite and the common people who listened to these tales in the evening markets. The irrigation systems that fed these gardens represented engineering achievements that would inspire admiration even in later centuries. Mari's hydraulic engineers had learned to harness the Euphrates not merely for basic survival, but for the creation of abundance, channeling the river's flow through a network of canals and distributaries that could support both practical agriculture and ornamental horticulture. Water wheels turned slowly in the current, their wooden spokes catching the light as they lifted river water into elevated channels that carried life to every corner of the palace complex. These engineering marvels extended beyond the palace walls into the city proper, where public fountains provided both practical water access and aesthetic focal points for neighborhood gathering spaces. The sound of flowing water became part of Mari's urban symphony, a constant gentle murmur that reminded inhabitants of their city's mastery over one of life's most essential elements, children would play around these fountains while their mothers filled water jars, creating scenes of daily life that painters and sculptors would capture in works of art that celebrated the ordinary moments that made life beautiful. Mari's influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries through the careful cultivation of diplomatic relationships that transformed the city into one of the ancient world's most important political centres. The Royal Correspondence Archive, discovered millennia later by archaeologists, would reveal a network of international relations so sophisticated that it rivaled the diplomatic systems of much later historical periods. Letters written on clay tablets travelled regularly between Marian capitals across the known world, carrying messages that shaped the fate of nations. The diplomatic quarter of the palace buzzed with activity as ambassadors from distant kingdoms arrived to seek audience with King Zimri-Lim and his successors. These envoys brought with them not only official messages from their rulers, but also intelligence about political developments, trade opportunities, and potential threats that could affect the delicate balance of power that kept the region stable. Mari's kings understood that information was often more valuable than gold, and they invested heavily in maintaining networks of informants and allies who could provide early warning of changes in the political wind. Royal marriages became instruments of statecraft, carefully arranged alliances that bound Mari to other kingdoms through bonds of kinship that theoretically transcended temporary political disagreements. Princess Yasma Adu, daughter of Mari's royal house, would travel to distant Katna to marry into that kingdom's ruling family, taking with her not only a substantial dowry, but also the promise of mutual support between the two cities. These marriage alliances created webs of obligation and mutual interest that helped maintain peace across regions that might otherwise have been consumed by constant warfare. The scribal schools of Mari played a crucial role in maintaining these diplomatic relationships by training young men in the complex art of international correspondence. Students learned not only the technical aspects of cuneiform writing, but also the subtle protocols that governed communication between kingdoms. A misplaced word or inappropriate phrase could inadvertently cause offence and potentially disrupt relationships that had taken years to establish. So these diplomatic scribes underwent rigorous training in both language and etiquette. Treaties carved in stone and written on precious metals established formal frameworks for cooperation between Mari and its neighbours. These agreements covered everything from mutual defence pacts to trade regulations, from marriage arrangements to protocols for settling disputes. The legal traditions that emerged from these diplomatic practices would influence international law for centuries, establishing precedents for how sovereign states could interact peacefully even when their interests didn't perfectly align. Mari's position along the Euphrates made it an ideal location for summit meetings between rulers who might otherwise have difficulty meeting safely. The city's reputation for neutrality and fair dealing encouraged kings and queens from across the region to choose Mari as a venue for important negotiations, bringing economic benefits through the hosting of these high-level diplomatic events, while also enhancing the city's reputation as a centre of international cooperation. In the winding streets of Mari's artisan quarter, the sound of hammers on metal created a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of creative endeavour. Here, in workshops that opened directly onto narrow cobblestone alleys, craftsmen pursued their trades with the dedication that transcended mere commercial interest. These were artists as much as they were artisans, men and women who understood that their work would outlive them, that the objects they created would carry something of their spirit into a future they would never see. The goldsmiths of Mari achieved a level of technical sophistication that would be the envy of craftsmen in much later periods. Their workshops, equipped with furnaces capable of reaching precisely controlled temperatures, produced jewellery and decorative objects that combine technical excellence with artistic vision. Delicate filigree work created patterns so intricate they seemed to capture light itself, while larger pieces demonstrated mastery of techniques like repoussé and chasing that required years of patient practice to perfect. Royal commissions provided these craftsmen with opportunities to create masterworks that pushed the boundaries of their technical capabilities. When King Zimri-Lim requested a ceremonial crown for his coronation, the palace goldsmiths collaborated to produce a work of art that would be remembered for generations. The crown incorporated gold leaf so thin it was nearly transparent, inlaid with precious stones arranged in patterns that told the story of Mari's founding and growth. Every element of its design carried symbolic meaning, from the stylized river patterns that honored the Euphrates to the astronomical motifs that placed Mari's rulers in cosmic context. The textile workers of Mari developed weaving techniques that created fabrics of extraordinary beauty and durability. Their looms, some large enough to require multiple operators, produced cloth that was sought after across the known world. Royal garments woven in Mari workshops featured complex patterns that required months of careful work to complete, designs that incorporated symbolic elements meaningful to the kingdom's religious and political traditions, while demonstrating the technical mastery of their creators. Natural dyes created from plants, minerals, and insects produced colours of remarkable intensity and permanence. The deep blues achieved using lapis lazuli powder rivaled the colour of the sky at twilight, while reds extracted from certain beetles created shades so vibrant they seemed to glow within a fire. These dyes were often more valuable than the textiles themselves, representing trade relationships that extended to the remotest corners of the ancient world. Apprenticeship systems in Mari's artisan quarter ensured that technical knowledge passed from generation to generation, while also allowing for innovation and development of new techniques. Young people who showed aptitude for particular crafts would enter into formal relationships with master craftsmen, learning not only the practical skills of their chosen trade, but also the cultural traditions and artistic sensibilities that made Mari's handicrafts distinctive. These apprenticeships often lasted for years, creating bonds between teacher and student that resembled family relationships as much as commercial arrangements. The workshops themselves became centres of cultural exchange, as visiting craftsmen from other kingdoms brought new techniques and design ideas that gradually merged with local traditions. A metalworker from Anatolia might introduce new methods for working bronze, while a weaver from the Indus Valley could share knowledge of cotton cultivation and processing. These cultural exchanges enriched Mari's artistic traditions, while also spreading the city's influence to distant regions through the diaspora of craftsmen who had learned their trades in Mari's workshops. The great temple of Dagon, Mari's patron deity, rose from the centre of the city like a mountain made by human hands, its ziggurat form reaching toward heaven with an ambition that spoke of humanity's eternal desire to bridge the gap between earth and sky. The temple complex occupied several acres of prime urban real estate, its boundaries marked by walls that separated sacred space from the secular world, while also serving as a visual reminder of the divine authority that legitimized royal power. Within these walls, priests and priestesses conducted rituals that maintained the cosmic order upon which all human prosperity depended. The daily ceremonies began before dawn, when the first priest would kindle the sacred fire that would burn throughout the day, sending smoke skyward as a bridge between the human and divine realms. These rituals followed patterns established centuries earlier, their precise execution requiring years of training and an understanding of religious principles that went far beyond mere memorization of words and actions. The temple's architecture embodied theological principles that made abstract religious concepts concrete and visible. The ziggurat stepped form represented the layers of existence that separated earth from heaven, with each level corresponding to different aspects of divine reality. Pilgrims who climbed the exterior staircases would experience a physical journey that mirrored their spiritual ascent, moving from the ordinary world of daily concerns toward the rarefied atmosphere where gods and humans could meet. Temple workshops produced religious art and ceremonial objects that combined practical function with spiritual significance. Sacred vessels used in rituals were crafted with the same attention to detail as royal regalia, their surfaces decorated with images and symbols that told stories from Mari's religious mythology. These objects served not merely as tools for conducting ceremonies, but as focal points for meditation and prayer, physical embodiments of abstract spiritual principles. The temple's economic role extended far beyond its religious functions, making it one of Mari's most important institutions for wealth, generation, and distribution. Temple lands scattered throughout the kingdom provided agricultural income that funded not only religious activities, but also educational and charitable programs that served the broader community. The priests who managed these resources became skilled administrators whose expertise rivaled that of secular officials. Religious festivals provided occasions for community celebration that reinforced social bonds while also demonstrating Mari's prosperity and divine favour to visitors from other kingdoms. During the annual celebration of Dagon's victory over chaos, the entire city participated in processions that wound through the streets, with citizens contributing according to their means to create spectacles that amazed foreign observers. These festivals served multiple functions. They reinforced religious belief, strengthened community identity, and advertised Mari's wealth and stability to potential allies and enemies alike. The temple library contained religious texts copied by generations of scribes, preserving not only the specific beliefs and practices of Mari's religious tradition, but also serving as a repository for wisdom literature that addressed fundamental questions about human existence. These texts, written on durable clay tablets, included creation myths, moral teachings, and philosophical reflections that influenced religious and ethical thinking throughout the region. Sacred music played an integral role in temple worship, with choirs trained in complex harmonies that were believed to reflect the music of the spheres. Temple musicians developed new instruments and refined existing ones, creating sounds that were intended to transcend ordinary human experience and provide glimpses of divine reality. The harps, lyres, and drums used in religious ceremonies represented the highest achievements of Mari's musical culture, their construction requiring skills that bordered on the magical. The Euphrates flowed through Mari's consciousness as much as through its physical boundaries, shaping the city's identity in ways that extended far beyond mere geographical accident. The river's seasonal rhythms became the city's calendar, its floods and recessions, marking time in patterns that connected human activity to cosmic cycles larger than individual lives or even individual generations. Mari's inhabitants learned to read the river's moods like farmers read the sky, understanding that their prosperity depended upon maintaining harmony with forces beyond human control. River festivals celebrated this fundamental relationship between city and water, with ceremonies that honored the Euphrates as both practical resource and divine manifestation. During the spring floods, when the river swelled beyond its normal boundaries and brought fertile silt to the surrounding farmlands, grateful citizens would gather at the water's edge to offer thanks through songs, dances, and ritual offerings that floated downstream carrying prayers for continued abundance. The harbour district buzzed with activity as boats of every size and description crowded the docks, their masts creating a forest of timber that swayed gently with the river's current. Cargo vessels built for capacity rather than speed carried grain and manufactured goods downstream toward Babylon, while elegant passenger boats transported diplomats and wealthy merchants upstream toward the kingdoms of northern Syria. The skills required to navigate the Euphrates' changing channels and seasonal hazards were passed down through families of boatmen who regarded their knowledge as sacred trust. Mari's shipbuilders developed vessel designs that were perfectly adapted to the Euphrates' particular characteristics, creating boats that could handle both the river's gentle meanders and the occasional rapids that mark transitions between different geological regions. These vessels represented significant technological achievements, incorporating innovations in hull design, sail configuration, and steering systems that influenced boat building throughout Mesopotamia. The river served as Mari's highway to the world, connecting the city to trade networks that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Goods that began their journeys in Mari's warehouses could end up in markets separated by thousands of miles of difficult overland travel, while products from distant kingdoms arrived in Mari carrying the marks of their exotic origins. This river-based commerce created wealth that supported not only the merchant class, but also the craftsmen, administrators, and labourers whose work made long-distance trade possible. Fishing villages scattered along the riverbank supplied Mari's markets with fresh fish that provided protein for both rich and poor citizens. The techniques used by these fishermen represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about the Euphrates ecosystem, knowledge that was essential for sustainable exploitation of the river's biological resources. Seasonal fish runs brought temporary abundance that was preserved through drying, salting, and other techniques that allowed riverine resources to be stored against times of scarcity. The river also served as Mari's first line of defense, its channels and marshes creating natural barriers that could slow enemy advances while providing escape routes for defenders. Military engineers learned to use the Euphrates flow patterns to their advantage, creating artificial channels that could be flooded or dried as tactical situation demanded. The city's fortifications incorporated the river into their defensive scheme, making water-based approaches as difficult for enemies as land-based assaults. Religious traditions associated the Euphrates with divine favour, seeing in its life-giving waters evidence of the gods' continued blessing upon Mari and its people. Temple ceremonies often concluded with ritual washings in the river, symbolic purifications that connected individual spiritual cleansing to the cosmic purification that the waters represented. The river thus became not only Mari's lifeline, but also its connection to the sacred forces that governed existence itself. As evening approached and the setting sun painted the Euphrates in shades of gold and crimson, Mari's citizens would often gather along the riverbank to watch the daily miracle of sunset reflected in moving water. These moments of quiet contemplation connected them to generations of their ancestors who had witnessed the same spectacle, creating a sense of continuity that transcended the troubles and triumphs of any particular historical moment. In the river's eternal flow, they found both comfort and inspiration, evidence that some things endure even as others pass away into the silence of memory. The sound of water moving over stone created a constant background melody that became so much a part of Mari's soundscape that visitors often commented on its absence when they returned to their landlocked homes. This watery music accompanied every aspect of daily life, from the busy commerce of the harbour district to the quiet prayers offered in riverside shrines. It was the sound of life itself, flowing endlessly toward a sea that none of them would ever see, but all of them somehow understood as their ultimate destination. And in the darkness that followed sunset, when the river became a ribbon of starlight flowing through the sleeping city, Mari's dream of greatness continued to unfold, carried forward by currents both literal and metaphorical that would determine not only the city's immediate future, but also its place in the vast tapestry of human civilization. The Euphrates had nurtured Mari from a simple crossing point to a jewel of the ancient world, and the river's embrace continued to shape the city's destiny in ways that would echo through millennia yet to come. The final betrayal came not with thunder, but with the quiet scratch of reed upon clay, as messages flowed between palaces like poison in the bloodstream of diplomacy. In the shadows of the great ziggurat of Babylon, Hammurabi's scribes worked through the night, their fingers stained with ink and ambition, crafting the words that would seal Mari's fate. The year was 1761 BCE, and the world was about to witness the methodical destruction of a civilization that had stood as a beacon of culture and commerce for over a millennium. Zimri-Lim, king of Mari, stood upon the highest terrace of his palace, gazing eastward toward the rising sun. The morning light cast long shadows across the Euphrates, and somewhere in those shadows he sensed the approaching storm. His spies had brought disturbing news from Babylon. Hammurabi's armies were mobilizing, supply trains stretched along the royal road, and the great king's attention had turned unmistakably toward Mari. Yet even in this dark hour, Zimri-Lim could not have imagined the calculating coldness with which his former ally planned not merely conquest, but complete obliteration. The art of ancient diplomacy was a delicate dance of words, where meaning lurked beneath meaning, and a single phrase could carry the weight of kingdoms. Hammurabi had mastered this art to perfection, weaving a web of alliances and betrayals that would make Machiavelli himself pause in admiration. For years he had corresponded with Zimri-Lim as a brother, sharing intelligence about mutual enemies, coordinating military campaigns, and maintaining the fiction of enduring friendship. Yet beneath this veneer of camaraderie, the Babylonian king harboured ambitions that would reshape the entire ancient Near East. In the royal archives of Mari, thousands of cuneiform tablets chronicled the steady deterioration of relations between the two great powers. The correspondence began to change subtly around 1763 BCE. As Hammurabi's tone grew increasingly formal, his requests more demanding, his responses to Mari's concerns more dismissive. Where once he had asked for Zimri-Lim's opinion on matters of mutual interest, now he simply informed the Mari king of decisions already made. The shift was so gradual that it resembled the slow erosion of riverbanks, imperceptible from day to day, but ultimately devastating in its cumulative effect. One particularly revealing tablet, discovered millennia later by archaeologists, contains Hammurabi's response to Zimri-Lim's request for assistance against a nomadic incursion. The Babylonian king's reply is a masterpiece of diplomatic evasion. "My brother speaks of troubles with the wandering peoples, yet I wonder if the strength of Mari has grown so weak that it cannot handle such minor irritations alone. Perhaps it is time for my brother to consider whether his kingdom might benefit from closer guidance in such matters." The implied threat was unmistakable, yet couched in language that allowed for plausible denial. Zimri-Lim was no fool. He recognized the changing dynamics and began to prepare for the possibility of conflict. Mari's military was reorganized, defensive fortifications were strengthened, and diplomatic overtures were made to potential allies throughout Mesopotamia and Syria. The king's correspondence from this period reveals a man walking a tightrope between appeasement and defiance, desperately seeking a path that would preserve his kingdom's independence without provoking Hammurabi's wrath. The Mari king's most trusted advisor, a brilliant diplomat named Yasim-El, counselled extreme caution. His letters to provincial governors throughout the kingdom painted a stark picture of the gathering storm. The great king of Babylon speaks of brotherhood while sharpening his sword. We must prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Strengthen your walls, gather your granaries, and watch the roads. The storm that comes will test every foundation we have built. These words, preserved in clay, carry the weight of prophecy. Meanwhile, in Babylon, Hammurabi's court buzzed with preparations for what would become one of the most methodical campaigns of destruction in ancient history. The king had studied Mari's strengths and weaknesses with the attention of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. He understood that Mari's wealth came from its position as a trading hub, its diplomatic influence from its extensive network of allies, and its military strength from its professional army and formidable fortifications. Each of these advantages would have to be systematically eliminated. The first phase of Hammurabi's strategy involved isolating Mari diplomatically. Using a combination of threats, bribes, and promises, he worked to detach Mari's allies one by one. Small kingdoms that had long looked to Mari for protection were quietly approached with offers they could not refuse. Join Babylon's growing empire as willing vassals, or face the consequences of continued loyalty to a doomed ally. One by one, Mari's friends melted away like snow before the desert sun. The economic warfare began almost imperceptibly. Trade routes that had long favoured Mari suddenly became less secure as Babylonian-aligned tribes began to raid caravans travelling to and from the city. Diplomatic missions from distant kingdoms found excuses to avoid Mari, while Babylon's ambassadors were welcomed with increasing enthusiasm throughout the region. The economic lifeblood of Mari slowly began to constrict as Hammurabi's influence spread like a vast web across Mesopotamia. The final diplomatic exchange between the two kings reads like a funeral dirge for the age of independent city-states. Zimri-Lim, in a last desperate attempt to salvage the relationship, wrote to Hammurabi with heartbreaking dignity, "To my brother, the great king of Babylon, greetings. The bonds that have long united our houses were forged in the fires of mutual respect and shared purpose. I cannot believe that these sacred ties can be broken by misunderstanding or the whispers of enemies. Let us speak as brothers once more, that the children of our kingdoms might continue to know peace." Hammurabi's response was brief and devastating in its finality. To Zimri-Lim, who calls himself King of Mari, "The time for words between us has passed. You will submit to the authority of Babylon and acknowledge me as your overlord, or you will face the consequences of defiance. There is no third path." With these words, over a century of alliance and friendship was swept away, leaving only the inexorable logic of conquest. The mobilization of ancient armies was a spectacle that could be witnessed from great distances as columns of soldiers, supply wagons, and siege equipment stretched across the landscape like vast serpents of bronze and leather. In the spring of 1761 BCE, such a serpent began to uncoil from the gates of Babylon, its destination no secret to any who cared to observe its path. Hammurabi had assembled the largest military force seen in Mesopotamia since the days of Sargon the Great, a carefully orchestrated instrument of destruction designed not merely to defeat Mari, but to erase it from history. The Babylonian army was a marvel of organization and efficiency, reflecting the administrative genius that had made Hammurabi one of history's great conquerors. At its core were the veteran infantry regiments, hardened by decades of successful campaigns against Larsa, Eshnunna, and other rivals. These men carried the finest bronze weapons money could buy, their spear points gleaming like stars in the morning sun, their leather armour reinforced with bronze scales that clinked softly as they marched in perfect formation. Behind the infantry came the engineers and siege specialists, men who understood the ancient arts of breaking walls and overwhelming defenders. They brought with them the tools of their trade, massive battering rams carved from the hardest oak, siege towers that could be assembled to tower over any fortification, and the mysterious machines that hurled stones with devastating force. Most fearsome of all were the specialists in the art of undermining, men who could burrow beneath the strongest walls like human moles, setting fires and supports that would bring down seemingly impregnable defences. The cavalry, though limited by the equestrian technology of the age, formed an elite corps of scouts and shock troops. Mounted on sturdy donkeys and the first experimental horses imported from the northern steppes, these warriors could strike with lightning speed and disappear before enemy forces could respond. Their primary role would be to prevent relief forces from reaching Mari and to hunt down any messengers who might carry word of the city's plight to potential allies. Perhaps most ominous of all were the specialists in psychological warfare, men who understood that the conquest of a city began long before the first siege engine was wheeled into position. They carried with them instruments of terror, drums that could be heard for miles, designed to keep defenders awake night after night, banners bearing the symbols of defeated enemies, reminders of Babylon's inexorable march to dominance, and most chilling of all, cages that would display the fate of those foolish enough to resist Hammurabi's will. In Mari, the preparations for siege took on an increasingly frantic quality, as reports of Babylon's approach grew more detailed and alarming. Zimri-Lim threw himself into the task of preparing his city's defences with the desperate energy of a man who knew that failure meant not just political defeat, but the complete destruction of everything he held dear. The great palace, which had been a centre of art and learning, was transformed into a military headquarters where strategy sessions continued deep into the night by the flickering light of oil lamps. The city's formidable walls, which had protected Mari for centuries, were hastily strengthened and heightened. Gangs of workers laboured around the clock, adding new layers of mudbrick and stone to fortifications that were already among the most impressive in Mesopotamia. The western wall, facing the most likely direction of Babylonian approach, was reinforced with massive towers containing chambers for archers and slingers. Between these towers, the ramparts were widened to allow defenders to move quickly from one threatened point to another. Within the city, every available space was converted for military use. Temples became armories where blacksmiths worked frantically to forge new weapons and repair old ones. The great courtyard of the palace was transformed into a training ground, where civilians were taught the rudiments of archery and spear fighting. Even the famous gardens were partially sacrificed to the needs of defence, their ornamental pools converted into water storage for the coming siege. Most poignant of all were the preparations made by Mari's citizens to preserve their civilization's greatest treasures. In the deepest chambers of the palace, scribes worked to create copies of the most important tablets, hoping that at least some record of their culture might survive the coming catastrophe. Precious objects were carefully wrapped and hidden in secret chambers, while the city's most skilled artisans were quietly evacuated to distant territories where they might continue their crafts in exile. The last diplomatic mission to leave Mary before the siege began carried with it a message that would never be answered. Addressed to the kings of distant lands who had once competed for Mary's friendship, it read, "To all who remember the bonds of commerce and culture that once united our lands, the shadow of Babylon falls across our walls, yet we do not despair. Mary has stood for 1,000 years and has weathered many storms. If the gods will it, we shall weather this one as well. But if fate decrees otherwise, remember us not as we fall, but as we lived, as guardians of learning, patrons of art, and friends to all who sought wisdom and beauty in this harsh world." The Babylonian army appeared on the horizon like a dark stain spreading across the desert, visible from Mary's walls as a distant shimmer of bronze and dust that grew larger and more menacing with each passing hour. It was early summer when Hammurabi's forces finally invested the city, and the timing was no accident. The king had calculated that a summer siege would strain Mary's water supplies, while allowing his own forces to maintain clear supply lines back to Babylon. Every aspect of the campaign reflected the methodical planning that had made Hammurabi the most feared conqueror of his age. The siege lines that gradually encircled Mari were marvels of military engineering, designed not merely to contain the defenders, but to demonstrate Babylon's overwhelming superiority. The main camp, positioned just beyond the range of Mari's archers, was laid out with the precision of a permanent city. Streets ran at perfect right angles. Quarters for different units were clearly demarcated, and at the centre stood Hammurabi's command tent, a massive structure of leather and bronze that served as both military headquarters and symbol of royal authority. From this tent, the Babylonian king directed operations with the cool efficiency of a master chess player, moving pieces across a board. Each morning brought new orders carried by swift messengers to commanders throughout the siege lines. Siege engines were positioned and repositioned according to some grand design known only to Hammurabi and his closest advisors. Diversionary attacks were launched at predetermined intervals, designed not to capture the walls but to exhaust the defenders and probe for weaknesses. The psychological dimension of the siege was perhaps even more devastating than the physical assault. Each night, Babylonian drummers positioned around the city's perimeter began a rhythmic pounding that continued until dawn, a relentless beat designed to shatter nerves and prevent sleep. During the day, heralds approached Mari's gates under flags of truce, not to negotiate but to recite in loud voices the fate that had befallen other cities that had dared to resist Babylon's might. These propaganda speeches were masterpieces of psychological warfare, crafted to plant seeds of doubt and despair among Mari's defenders. Behold the fate of Eshnunna, whose walls were thought impregnable, until Babylon's rams spoke their final word. Remember Larsa, whose king boasted that his city would never fall, yet now his palace serves as a stable for Babylon's horses. Why do you persist in this hopeless defiance when honourable surrender yet remains possible? Inside the city, Zimri-Lim fought a different kind of battle against creeping despair and mounting desperation. His presence was required everywhere at once, on the walls to inspire the defenders, in council chambers to coordinate strategy, in the temples to maintain morale through religious observance, and in the palace to manage the increasingly complex logistics of a city under siege. The king seemed to age years in a matter of weeks, his face growing haggard, and his movements less assured as the weight of his people's survival pressed down upon his shoulders. The first major assault came at dawn on the 20th day of the siege, preceded by a bombardment from Babylonian siege engines that had been quietly moved into position during the night. The air filled with the whistle of stones and arrows as Mary's walls became the focus of concentrated fury. Defenders crouched behind their battlements, emerging only to loose their own arrows or to push away the scaling ladders that appeared with frightening regularity along the length of the fortifications. For 6 hours the assault continued with relentless intensity. Babylonian infantry, protected by massive shields, advanced in waves toward the walls while their archers provided covering fire. The great ram, pulled by dozens of oxen and protected by a mobile roof of thick timbers, began its thunderous work against the main gate. With each impact, the ancient timbers groaned and splintered, and dust rose from the stones as if the very foundations of the city were crying out in pain. Yet Mary's defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were fighting not just for victory but for the continued existence of their civilization. Archers on the walls picked off Babylonian soldiers with deadly precision, their arrows finding gaps in armor with skills honed by generations of warfare. Cauldrons of boiling oil were poured down upon attacking forces, turning siege ladders into pillars of flame and agony. Most effective of all were the great stones that defenders dropped from the heights, crushing siege engines and creating temporary obstacles that disrupted Babylonian formations. When the first assault finally broke against Mari's defences like a wave against an unyielding cliff, both sides could claim a form of victory. The Babylonians had probed the city's defences thoroughly and identified several weak points for future exploitation, while Mary's defenders had proven that her walls were not mere decoration, but formidable barriers manned by warriors worthy of respect. Yet the cost had been terrible for both sides, and everyone knew that this had been merely the first movement in a deadly symphony that would continue until one side or the other could fight no more. The night after the first assault, as burial parties from both armies worked by torchlight to clear the dead from the field, an eerie quiet settled over the besieged city. In the palace, Zimri-Lim met with his surviving commanders to assess their situation. The reports were sobering. Ammunition was running low, several sections of the wall had been damaged, and most critically the great cisterns that supplied the city's water were beginning to show alarming drops in level. The siege, all realized, had only just begun. As summer deepened into the brutal heat of Mesopotamian autumn, the siege of Mari transformed from a test of military strength into a contest of endurance that would push both sides to the very limits of human suffering. The Babylonian lines had settled into the patient rhythm of professional besiegers, men who understood that time itself could be a weapon more deadly than any bronze sword or siege engine. Each day brought the same routine: dawn attacks to keep the defenders exhausted, midday bombardments to wear down the fortifications, and evening preparations for the next day's assault. Within Mari's walls, the civilian population began to experience the slow anguish of a city cut off from the world. Food rationing became increasingly severe as the carefully hoarded supplies dwindled with each passing week. The great markets that had once buzzed with merchants from distant lands now served as distribution centres, where citizens queued with pottery bowls to receive their daily portion of barley and dates. Children who had grown up knowing abundance now learned the hollow feeling of persistent hunger, their games forgotten as they helped their parents search for anything edible among the city's remaining resources. Water, that most precious commodity in the desert lands of Mesopotamia, became an obsession that governed every aspect of daily life. The great cisterns that had once seemed inexhaustible were now measured and guarded with religious devotion. Citizens were allocated precise amounts based on a complex formula that took into account family size, occupation, and contribution to the city's defence. Public baths, once a symbol of Maori's civilized abundance, were closed to conserve every possible drop for drinking and cooking. Most heartbreaking of all were the changes that siege imposed upon the city's children. The schools that had once taught writing, mathematics, and the great literature of Mesopotamia were converted into workshops where small hands learned to make arrows and repair armour instead of shaping cuneiform signs in wet clay. The laughter that had once echoed through Maori's streets gave way to the hushed voices of youngsters who had learned that unnecessary noise might somehow aid their enemies beyond the walls. Zimri-Lim attempted to maintain some semblance of normal civic life through sheer force of will, holding court in the great throne room even as the sounds of battle echoed from the walls. He continued to receive petitions from his subjects, rendered judgments in legal disputes, and maintained the elaborate ceremonies that had always marked the rhythm of royal life in Maori. Yet those who knew him best could see the toll that command was taking. His hands shook slightly as he held documents. His voice carried a new hoarseness from long hours of shouting orders over the din of combat, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much suffering. The king's personal correspondence from this period, preserved by the accident of history, reveals a ruler grappling with decisions that no mortal should have to make. One tablet, apparently never sent, contains a draft of a letter to his wife and children who'd been evacuated to safety in a distant kingdom. My beloved family, each day I think of surrendering this hopeless fight and joining you in exile, far from the death that stalks these streets. Yet how can I abandon the people who have trusted me with their lives? How can I be the king who allowed Maori to perish when so many before me preserved it through equally dark times? I pray to all the gods that they will give me wisdom, for I fear my strength alone is no longer sufficient. The second major assault came without warning in the pre-dawn darkness of the siege's 40th day, launched under cover of a sandstorm that reduced visibility to mere yards. Babylonian engineers had spent weeks tunneling beneath Maori's eastern wall, supporting their excavation with wooden beams that could be quickly burned away when the moment came. The roar of collapsing masonry mixed with the howling wind as an entire section of fortification collapsed, creating a breach through which assault troops poured like a black flood. The fighting that followed was unlike anything in the siege's previous battles, a desperate melee conducted in near total darkness among the rubble of broken walls and collapsed buildings. Maori's defenders, caught off guard by the sudden breach, nonetheless responded with remarkable speed, forming defensive lines among the ruins and turning every pile of stones into a fortress. Zimri-Lim himself appeared in the breach, his royal sword catching the faint light of torches as he fought alongside his humblest soldiers in a display of courage that would be remembered in song and story for generations to come. For 3 hours the battle raged in the breach, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Babylonian troops, despite their superior numbers and preparation, found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to multiply in the darkness, as every citizen of Maori capable of bearing arms joined the desperate defence of their homes. Children threw stones from rooftops, women poured boiling water from upper windows, and elderly priests emerged from temples carrying ancient ceremonial weapons that had not tasted blood in living memory. Yet courage alone could not overcome the mathematics of warfare. As dawn broke over the battle-scarred city, it became clear that Mari's defenders had given everything they had and more, but that everything was not enough. The breach held, barely, but at a cost that made victory indistinguishable from defeat. Nearly half of Mari's remaining warriors lay dead or wounded among the rubble, and the city's ammunition stores were almost completely exhausted. Most critically, the collapse of the eastern wall had damaged the underground chambers that held the city's last water reserves. In the grim council of war that followed the battle, Mari's surviving leaders faced the reality that their situation had become hopeless. The city could perhaps withstand one more major assault, but certainly not two. Water supplies would last perhaps another week, food for a little longer. The children who had fought so bravely in the breach were now too weak from hunger to stand watch on the remaining walls. The moment that every besieged city fears had arrived, the choice between death with honour and surrender with the hope of mercy. Zimri-Lim listened to his advisor's counsel with the bearing of a man who'd already made his decision, but needed to hear it confirmed by others. Some urged immediate surrender, arguing that Hammurabi might show mercy to a city that yielded before complete destruction became necessary. Others demanded that Mari fight to the last, maintaining that a glorious death was preferable to the shame of submission. The debate continued through the day and into the night, while on the walls exhausted sentries watched for signs of the next Babylonian assault. The final messenger to leave Mari carried with him the weight of a civilization's last words, his donkey's hooves raising small clouds of dust as he disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, racing toward distant kingdoms that might at least preserve the memory of what was about to be lost. Zimri-Lim had spent the entire night composing his final dispatch, a document that was part historical record, part confession, and part defiant declaration of principles that transcended mere political survival. To the kings of the world, greetings from Zimri-Lim, who was king of Mari, the message began. By the time these words reach you, our city may be no more than memory and dust. Yet I would have the world know that we chose our fate freely, and that the choice was not made in vain. Mari could have bowed to Babylon's will and preserved its buildings, its walls, and the lives of its people, but to do so would have meant the death of something more precious than life itself, the idea that wisdom and beauty deserve to exist for their own sake, that small kingdoms have the right to chart their own destiny, and that power alone does not grant the right to rule over the spirits of free men. As the sun rose on what would prove to be Mari's last day as an independent kingdom, the city presented a heart-rending spectacle of defiant dignity in the face of inevitable doom. Citizens who had conserved water with religious devotion now used their final rations to wash themselves and don their finest clothes, determined that if they must die, they would meet death as befitted the heirs of 1,000 years of civilization. In the temples, priests conducted services with the solemn beauty of final rites, their voices raised in hymns that had echoed through Mari's streets since time immemorial. The great palace, where kings had held court and received ambassadors from the corners of the known world, was prepared for its final ceremony. Zimri-Lim, dressed in the full regalia of his office, took his place on the ancient throne where his ancestors had ruled in peace and prosperity. Around him gathered the surviving nobles and officials of his court, men and women who had chosen to remain with their king rather than flee to safety in distant lands. The scene possessed a tragic grandeur that would have moved even their enemies to admiration, had any Babylonian been present to witness it. From his command tent, Hammurabi observed the silence that had fallen over Mari's walls and knew that the moment of final decision had arrived. His scouts reported no movement on the battlements, no signs of preparation for another desperate defense. The great city was holding its breath, waiting for whatever mercy or justice the conqueror might decree. For Hammurabi, this moment represented the culmination of years of planning and months of siege. Yet the victory brought with it responsibilities that weighed heavily on even his experienced shoulders. The Babylonian king faced a choice that would define his legacy as surely as his famous code of laws. Mari could be allowed to surrender with honor, its people spared and its wealth absorbed into Babylon's growing empire. Such mercy would demonstrate magnanimity and might encourage other cities to yield without costly sieges. Yet Hammurabi had learned the lessons of conquest from the masters who had come before him. A city that had defied his will so completely, that had cost him so many soldiers and so much time, could not be allowed to survive as a potential symbol of resistance to his authority. The terms that Hammurabi's herald delivered to Mari's gates were as final as death itself. The city would be given 1 day to evacuate its civilian population, but all buildings, walls, and fortifications would be destroyed so completely that not one stone would remain upon another. The palace archives, the libraries, the temples, the workshops where master craftsmen had created works of beauty for centuries, all would be consigned to flames. Mari would not merely be conquered, it would be erased from the earth so thoroughly that future generations might doubt it had ever existed at all. Zimri-Lim received these terms in the throne room where his dynasty had ruled for generations, surrounded by the artistic treasures and intellectual achievements that represented the finest flowering of Mesopotamian civilization. His response was delivered with the dignity that had characterized his entire reign, even in its darkest hour. Tell your master that Mari accepts his terms, not from fear of death, but from love of life. Our people will live to carry forward what we have learned and created. Our buildings may fall, but the ideas they sheltered will find new homes in the hearts of those who survive. We thank the great king of Babylon for granting us this final mercy. The evacuation of Mari began immediately, and proceeded with the heartbreaking efficiency of a people who had prepared for this moment even while praying it would never come. Long columns of citizens, carrying only what they could bear on their backs, began the journey into exile. Children clutched toys that would be their only tangible connection to the homes they were leaving forever, while elderly citizens cast final glances at neighborhoods where they had lived entire lifetimes. Most poignant of all were the scholars and scribes who'd been entrusted with copies of Mari's most precious documents, men and women who bore upon their shoulders the intellectual heritage of a civilization. As the last civilians passed through Mari's gates, Zimri-Lim made his final tour of the palace that had been the center of his world. He walked through chambers where he'd held counsel with the wisest men of his age, through gardens where he had found peace in times of trouble, through the throne room where justice had been dispensed and great decisions made. In each room he paused to touch familiar objects and to offer silent farewells to the ghosts of happier times. The king's final act as ruler of Mari was to personally kindle the fires that would consume his palace's archives, ensuring that the precious documents would burn cleanly, rather than be scattered and destroyed by Babylonian soldiers. As the flames began to lick at the cedar shelves where thousands of tablets had recorded the daily life and high culture of his kingdom, Zimri-Lim spoke the words that would serve as Mari's epitaph. What we built in stone may fall, but what we built in the human spirit shall endure forever. With the evacuation complete, Babylonian forces entered the empty city like a dark tide flowing through abandoned streets. The work of destruction began immediately and proceeded with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all of Hammurabi's operations. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble within hours, their stones scattered so widely that later, generations would struggle to determine where the great structures had once stood. The mighty walls that had protected Mari through countless sieges were pulled down block by block, their materials carried away to build fortifications for Babylon's expanding empire. Yet the most devastating destruction was reserved for Mari's intellectual and cultural treasures. Libraries that had preserved the wisdom of ages were consumed in bonfires that burned for days, their smoke visible from great distances as it rose like a dark prayer toward the heavens. Workshops where master craftsmen had created objects of beauty for kings and gods were stripped of their tools and materials, their techniques lost forever when their practitioners were scattered to the winds of exile. The great palace, which had been the wonder of the ancient world, suffered the most complete destruction of all. Room by room, it was methodically dismantled until not a single trace remained of the splendor that had once housed kings and received ambassadors from the ends of the earth. The throne room where Zimri-Lim had made his final stand was filled with rubble and dirt, sealed beneath layers of debris so thick that its very location would become a matter for archaeological speculation thousands of years in the future. When the work of destruction was complete, Hammurabi ordered that the ruins be covered with earth and sown with salt, symbolically ensuring that nothing would ever grow again on the site where Mari had stood. The very name of the city was to be struck from official records, its memory suppressed so completely that future generations would know it only as a cautionary tale about the fate of those who dared to defy Babylon's will. As the last Babylonian soldiers departed from what had once been Mari, they left behind a landscape that resembled nothing so much as a natural hill rising from the desert floor. The Euphrates continued to flow past the site, its waters carrying away the last physical traces of a civilization that had flourished for over a millennium. The silence that settled over the ruins was complete and profound, broken only by the whisper of wind across empty ground and the distant cry of birds that had once nested in the gardens of kings. Yet even as Mari disappeared from the physical world, its influence began to spread through the exile communities that had carried its culture to distant lands. Former citizens of the great city became advisors to foreign kings, teachers in foreign schools, and craftsmen in foreign workshops. The legal traditions developed in Mari's courts influenced the development of law throughout Mesopotamia, while its artistic styles could be traced in the work of artists who had never seen the original city but had learned from its displaced masters. In this way, Mari achieved a form of immortality that no amount of physical destruction could erase. Though its buildings had fallen and its walls were scattered, the ideas and traditions that had flourished within those boundaries continued to shape the development of human civilization. The city had died, but the spirit that had animated it lived on in the minds and hearts of all who had been touched by its influence. The destruction of Mari marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the long story of human cultural development, as the seeds of its greatness took root in distant soils and grew into new forms of beauty and wisdom. The walls that had stood for nearly 2,000 years crumbled not in a single moment, but slowly, like the dying breath of an ancient god. Hammurabi's soldiers moved through Mari's streets with the methodical precision of men who understood that they were dismantling more than buildings. They were erasing a way of life that had flourished since the dawn of civilization itself. in the great palace where Zimri-Lim had once held court, where ambassadors from distant kingdoms had bowed before the lion throne, flames consumed the cedar beams that had been gifts from Lebanese princes. The smoke rose black against the desert sky, carrying with it the scent of frankincense that had perfumed these halls, the oils that had anointed kings, the papyrus scrolls that had recorded the dreams and fears of an empire. The massive wooden doors, each one carved with protective spirits and inlaid with precious metals, were torn from their hinges. The bronze lions that had guarded the throne room were melted down, their proud faces reduced to shapeless metal that would serve Babylonian purposes. Room by room, corridor by corridor, the palace that had taken generations to build was systematically destroyed. But in their thoroughness, Hammurabi's men accomplished something they never intended. As the upper floors collapsed, as walls crumbled inward, as debris filled the courtyards and halls, the archive rooms on the lower levels were sealed beneath tons of mud, brick and stone. The cuneiform tablets that recorded Mari's correspondence with the world, letters between kings, trade agreements, diplomatic treaties, personal messages between rulers and their families, were buried but preserved, protected by the very destruction meant to erase them. The city's inhabitants fled in scattered groups across the desert. Some found refuge in distant settlements along the Euphrates, carrying with them only what they could hold in their arms and the memories of a golden age that was ending. Others vanished into the nomadic tribes that wandered the steppes, their stories of Mari's glory becoming legends told around campfires, growing more mythical with each telling until truth and dream became indistinguishable. Those who remained in the ruins eked out a meagre existence among the rubble. They built simple shelters in the shadows of collapsed walls, used broken pottery for their daily needs, and gradually, over the course of generations, forgot that they were living in the remains of a great kingdom. To them, these were simply old walls, useful for blocking the desert wind. The Euphrates, which had been Mari's lifeline for millennia, began to change its course. The careful system of canals and irrigation channels that had sustained the city's prosperity fell into disrepair. Without maintenance, the waterways filled with silt. The gardens that had been the envy of Mesopotamia withered and died. The date palms, deprived of water, became skeletal monuments to fertility that had passed away. Sand began its patient conquest. At first it was merely dust that settled in corners, accumulated in doorways, drifted across abandoned courtyards, but year by year, decade by decade, century by century, the desert reclaimed what human hands had wrested from it 3,000 years before. The sand covered the broken statues, filled the empty rooms, buried the streets where merchants had once called out their wares in a dozen languages. Travellers passing through the region in later centuries sometimes noticed the artificial hill that rose from the desert floor, its regular contours suggesting human construction, beneath the natural accumulation of sand and wind-blown earth. But to most, it was simply another tell, another of the countless mounds that dotted the Mesopotamian landscape, remnants of settlements whose names had been forgotten, whose stories had been lost to time. The Assyrians, who conquered this region after Babylon, built their own cities and fortresses, but they showed no interest in the ancient mound by the Euphrates. The Persians who followed them were equally indifferent. The Greeks of Alexander's time marched past it on their way to greater conquests. The Romans, when they extended their empire eastward, noted it only as a landmark for their military maps. Islamic armies swept through these lands in the 7th century CE, bringing new faiths and new ways of life, but the tell that covered Mari's remains was ancient even to them. Arab geographers mentioned it in their works as Tel Hariri, the Mound of Silk, though none remembered why it carried that name. Local Bedouin tribes used it as a camping place during their seasonal migrations, their black tents pitched unknowingly above throne rooms where ancient kings had once decided the fate of empires. Centuries passed like seasons. The Ottoman Empire rose and fell. The great powers of Europe carved up the Middle East among themselves. Through all these changes, Mari slept beneath its blanket of sand, holding its secrets in silence. The cuneiform tablets lay in darkness, their clay surfaces preserving conversations between people who'd been dust for 4,000 years. The palace walls, though broken, still stood in their buried chambers, waiting for eyes that would know how to read the stories they could tell. The world changed around Mari's resting place in ways its ancient inhabitants could never have imagined. Steam engines crossed continents. Telegraph wires carried messages across oceans in minutes rather than months. Archaeologists began to unlock the secrets of ancient Egypt, translating hieroglyphs and opening tombs that had been sealed since the time of the pharaohs. But Mari remained hidden, patient as the desert itself. It was the French who would finally disturb its slumber. The mandate system established after the First World War placed Syria under French administration, and with French rule came French archaeologists, drawn by the promise of discoveries that might rival those being made in Egypt and Turkey. André Parrot was a young man with old eyes, the kind of scholar who could look at a barren landscape and see the shadows of vanished civilizations. In 1933, when he first approached Tel Hariri, he was not looking for Mari specifically. He was simply following the methodical process that had served archaeology well, investigating the most promising tells in the region to determine which might reward excavation. The local workers who joined his expedition were skeptical. They had lived their entire lives in sight of this mound, using it as grazing land for their flocks, never imagining that beneath their feet lay treasures that would rewrite the history of the ancient world. When Parrot's team began to dig, removing centuries of accumulated sand and debris, the workers muttered prayers and worried that they were disturbing the sleep of jinn or ancient spirits. The first discoveries were modest: pottery sherds, broken bricks, the kinds of artifacts that suggested human habitation but revealed little about its nature or importance. But Parrot was persistent, and archaeology rewards persistence above all other virtues. As his team dug deeper, working their way through the layers of accumulated time, they began to find objects that suggested this had been no ordinary settlement. A bronze figurine emerged from the soil, its craftsmanship too fine for a simple village. Cylinder seals bearing complex inscriptions were unearthed, their imagery speaking of royal power and divine authority. Fragments of wall paintings showed traces of lapis lazuli and gold leaf, luxuries that only the wealthier cities could afford. But it was the discovery of the palace that transformed Parrot's methodical excavation into one of archaeology's great adventures. As his workers cleared away the debris from what had initially seemed to be just another section of the tell, walls began to emerge. Not the simple mud brick construction of peasant houses, but massive walls built of carefully cut stone, their surfaces bearing the marks of master craftsmen. Room after room was revealed, each one larger and more elaborate than the last. Corridors wide enough for processions led to chambers decorated with intricate murals depicting gods and kings, battles and festivals, the daily life and sacred rituals of a civilization that had vanished from memory. The throne room, when finally cleared, proved to be vast enough to hold hundreds of courtiers, its walls covered with paintings that showed the king of Mari receiving tribute from subject peoples across the known world. But the greatest treasures were found in the archive rooms, chambers that had been sealed by the collapse of the palace's upper floors during Hammurabi's destruction. Here, protected by the very debris that had buried them, lay thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets, their clay surfaces bearing the written records of Mari's administration, diplomacy, and daily life. As Parrott and his team carefully excavated these archives, they realized they had stumbled upon something unprecedented in archaeology, a complete administrative archive from one of the ancient world's great kingdoms, preserved by accident and rediscovered by patience. The tablets were not just royal inscriptions or religious texts, though those were present in abundance. They were letters, personal correspondence between kings and their families, diplomatic negotiations between great powers, trade agreements, legal contracts, census records, tax rolls, and military dispatches. Reading these tablets was like listening to conversations from 4,000 years ago. Here was Zimri-Lim writing to his wife about matters of state and family. There was Hammurabi himself, in his early years as king of Babylon, writing as an ally and friend to Mari's ruler, discussing mutual defense against common enemies and the intricacies of regional politics. Military commanders reported on troop movements. Provincial governors requested supplies and reinforcements. Merchants complained about bandits and corrupt officials. The tablets revealed Mari not as a remote and mysterious ancient city, but as the capital of a sophisticated kingdom that had maintained diplomatic relations with powers from Anatolia to Egypt, that had controlled trade routes linking the Mediterranean world with the riches of the East, that had developed systems of administration and law that prefigured those of later empires. One tablet contained a letter from Zimri-Lim to a vassal king, discussing the proper protocol for a royal visit. Another recorded a complaint from the queen about the behaviour of her daughter-in-law. A third preserved the text of a treaty between Mari and a neighbouring kingdom, complete with clauses about extradition of fugitives and the protection of merchants. These were not ancient mysteries or religious texts requiring complex interpretation. They were the everyday correspondence of real people dealing with problems that remained recognisable across the millennia. Among the most remarkable discoveries were the prophetic texts, records of messages delivered to the king by men and women who claimed to speak for the gods. These prophecies dealt with matters of war and peace, the selection of royal officials, and the proper performance of religious rituals. They provided unique insight into how ancient peoples understood the relationship between the divine and temporal spheres, how they sought guidance from their gods in matters of state. The palace itself proved to be one of ancient Mesopotamia's architectural marvels. Its 260 rooms had been arranged according to a complex plan that reflected both practical needs and religious beliefs. The royal apartments were decorated with wall paintings that depicted not just the power of Mari's kings, but the natural world they ruled. Gardens filled with date palms and flowering trees, rivers teeming with fish, forests populated by lions and deer. The throne room's famous mural showed Zimri-Lim receiving the rod and ring of kingship from the goddess Ishtar herself, but it was surrounded by scenes of abundance and prosperity. Farmers bringing in their harvests, craftsmen displaying their finest work, tributaries from distant lands presenting gifts to the throne. The message was clear. Mari's power rested not just on military might, but on its ability to create and maintain prosperity for its people. Excavation of the palace revealed sophisticated systems for water storage and waste management, evidence of central heating, and workshops where skilled artisans had created luxury goods for trade throughout the known world. The royal kitchens were equipped with bronze cookware that would not have looked out of place in a modern restaurant. The palace baths were supplied with hot and cold running water through a system of pipes and channels that demonstrated remarkable engineering skill. But perhaps the most poignant discoveries were the personal effects found in the palace rooms, jewellery that had belonged to Mary's queens, toys that had been played with by royal children, writing materials used by scribes who had served the crown for decades. These objects brought human immediacy to the distant past, transforming historical abstractions into the remains of individual lives lived with hopes and fears not unlike our own. As the years passed, an excavation continued. Parrott's team uncovered evidence of Mary's long history. Beneath the palace of Zimri-Lim lay the remains of earlier structures, including temples and royal buildings that dated back to Mary's earliest days as a Sumerian city-state. The tell contained layer upon layer of human occupation, each generation building upon the achievements and ruins of its predecessors. The religious quarter of the city revealed temples dedicated to various gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The Temple of Ishtar, Mary's patron goddess, contained votive offerings left by worshippers across many centuries, bronze figurines, stone bowls, jewellery and tablets recording prayers and vows. The temple's inner sanctum had been decorated with precious metals and stones, its walls covered with representations of the goddess in her various aspects, as warrior, lover, and protector of the city. The residential quarters showed how ordinary people had lived in Mari during its golden age. Their houses were built around central courtyards, with rooms arranged according to function and season. The kitchens contained bread ovens and storage jars for grain and oil. The workshops held the tools of craftsmen who had produced goods for both local consumption and international trade. Children's toys and games were found in the family quarters, along with the personal possessions of people who had lived full lives in the shadow of the great palace. The city's defensive walls, when fully excavated, proved to be massive constructions designed to withstand prolonged sieges. They incorporated towers and gates that controlled access to the city, with guard chambers where soldiers had maintained watch over the approaches from the desert and the river. The walls had been built and rebuilt multiple times over Mary's long history, each generation strengthening the defences that protected their prosperity. Evidence of the final siege was found throughout the excavation. Arrowheads and spear points bore testimony to the last battles fought in Mary's defence. Burned grain in storage rooms showed how Hammurabi's forces had systematically destroyed the city's ability to sustain itself. The hasty burial of treasures in various parts of the palace revealed how Mary's inhabitants had tried desperately to preserve their most precious possessions from the conquerors. But even in destruction, Mary had achieved a kind of immortality. The archives discovered by Parrott and his successors transformed scholarly understanding of the ancient Near East, providing previously unknown details about the political, economic and social systems that had governed some of humanity's earlier civilizations. Mary's letters and documents filled gaps in historical knowledge, corrected previous assumptions, and revealed the complexity and sophistication of Bronze Age society. The city that had once controlled the middle Euphrates through military might and diplomatic skill now exercised influence through the power of knowledge preserved in its archives. Scholars from around the world came to study Mary's tablets, learning the languages in which they were written, deciphering the complex political relationships they revealed, and gradually reconstructing the world in which Mary had played such a central role. Museums in Paris, Damascus, and other capitals displayed Mary's treasures. the bronze lions from the throne room, the intricate jewellery worn by Mari's queens, the cylinder seals used by its officials, the votive offerings left by its worshippers. These objects carried Mari's story to audiences who would never see the Syrian desert, where they had been buried for 4 millennia, spreading knowledge of this vanished civilization to every corner of the modern world. The work of excavation continued for decades after Parrott's initial discoveries, with each season revealing new aspects of Mari's civilization. Later, archaeologists found evidence of the city's international connections: pottery from Egypt, precious, stones from India, metals from Anatolia, all testimony to the far-reaching trade networks that Mari had controlled. They uncovered workshops where luxury goods had been manufactured for export, warehouses where international merchants had stored their wares, and administrative buildings where the complex business of governing a commercial empire had been conducted. The discoveries at Mari revolutionized understanding of ancient Mesopotamian religion, politics, diplomacy, and daily life. The prophetic texts provided unique insight into how ancient peoples sought divine guidance in their decision-making. The diplomatic correspondence revealed sophisticated systems of international law and negotiation that prefigured modern treaty-making. The administrative record showed how complex societies managed their resources and maintained order across large territories. But perhaps most importantly, Mari's rediscovery restored to history a civilization that had been lost to human memory for nearly 4,000 years. The city that had been erased by Hammurabi's conquest, that had slept beneath the desert for millennia, that had been forgotten by the peoples who built later civilizations in the same region, had returned to speak across the ages. Today, visitors to the site of Tel Hariri can walk through the excavated remains of Mari's palace, seeing for themselves the throne room where Zimri-Lim held court, the archives where scribes preserved the correspondence of kings, the workshops where artisans created treasures for international trade. The walls that Hammurabi ordered destroyed have been partially restored, not to their ancient glory, but enough to give modern eyes some sense of Mari's former magnificence. The Euphrates still flows past Mari's ruins, though its course has changed over the millennia. Date palms grow once again in the vicinity of the ancient city, though the elaborate gardens that once adorned the palace courtyards exist now only in the wall paintings that decorated royal chambers. The desert wind still blows across the Tel as it has for thousands of years, but now it carries the voices of tour guides and the footsteps of visitors rather than the silence of abandonment. In the museums of the world, Mari's treasures continue to speak to new generations. Children stand fascinated before the bronze lions that once guarded a throne room, unaware that they are looking at guardians that were old when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. Scholars continue to translate and study the thousands of tablets found in Mari's archives, each one potentially containing information that could illuminate some previously dark corner of ancient history. The story of Mari's rediscovery became a legend in its own right within archaeological circles. André Parrot's systematic excavation of Tel Hariri was held up as a model of how careful, patient work could yield extraordinary results. The complete preservation of the palace archives was recognized as one of archaeology's great strokes of luck, the kind of discovery that comes perhaps once in a century. But beyond its scientific importance, Mari's resurrection from the desert sand carried a deeper message about the persistence of human memory and the power of the written word to transcend time itself. The Cuneiform tablets that preserved Mari's history were humanity's early experiment with defeating death through writing, with creating permanent records that could outlast the civilizations that created them. In the end, Mari achieved through its destruction and rediscovery what it could never have achieved through conquest or commerce. The kingdom that had controlled trade routes for centuries, that had maintained diplomatic relations with the great powers of its age, that had built palaces and temples to display its wealth and power, had ultimately failed to preserve itself against the ambitions of Babylon. But the archives buried in its ruins had preserved something more valuable than gold or territory. They had preserved the voices of people who had lived and loved and struggled in a world so ancient it might as well have been another planet. Those voices still speak today, across a chasm of 4,000 years, carrying messages that remain recognizable because human nature itself remains constant across the millennia. Kings still worry about the loyalty of their allies. Parents still hope for their children's future. Merchants still complain about corrupt officials. Priests still seek to understand the will of heaven. Mari's story had become circular, complete. Born from the convergence of river and trade route, grown great through commerce and diplomacy, destroyed by the very forces that had made it powerful, buried by time and sand, and finally resurrected through the patient work of archaeologists who understood that the past has stories worth preserving. The wind that blows across Tel Hariri today carries echoes that only imagination can hear. The footsteps of merchants arriving with caravans from distant lands, the voices of scribes reading dispatches from foreign courts, the music that once filled palace courtyards during festivals celebrating Mari's prosperity. These echoes exist now only in the tablets and ruins that archaeology has preserved, but they are no less real for being recorded in cuneiform rather than sound. Mari had learned the ultimate lesson about human ambition and human memory, that power built on armies and treaties is ephemeral, lasting only as long as the strength to maintain it. But power built on knowledge and preserved in writing can outlast empires, can speak across millennia, can transform dust and ruins into windows that let modern eyes see into ancient souls. The city that had been lost to human memory for 4,000 years had found immortality not in the permanence of its stones, but in the persistence of its words. And in the Syrian desert, where the Euphrates continues its ancient journey toward the sea, the tell that covers Mari's remains stands as a monument not just to one lost civilization, but to the archaeological science that has learned to read the stories that time and sand conspire to hide. The mound of earth that farmers once used for grazing and travellers used as a landmark has become a bridge between worlds, connecting the modern age with humanity's earliest experiments in urban civilization, international diplomacy, and the written preservation of human experience. Beneath the blazing sun that has witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, Mari's story continues in the hands of each scholar who studies its tablets, each visitor who walks through its excavated rooms, each student who learns about its place in human history. The city that was built to control the crossroads of the ancient world has become itself a crossroads where past and present meet, where the voices of the dead continue to instruct the living, where 4,000 years dissolve like morning mist before the eternal human desire to be remembered, to be understood, to speak across time itself with words that will not die. The lost city of Mari sleeps no longer. It has awakened into a kind of immortality that its ancient rulers, for all their power and wealth, could never have imagined. Not the immortality of empire, which ends in conquest and destruction, but the immortality of knowledge, which transforms even ruins into teachers and makes the past present to any who have eyes to see and ears to hear the stories that the earth itself preserves for those patient enough to listen to the whispers of buried stones. Thank you for joining this timeless journey through the rise and rediscovery of Mari. If these ancient voices have moved you, if you found peace in their stories, please like this video and subscribe to Fall Asleep to History. Share these tales with others who seek rest in the embrace of the past, and let the wisdom of vanished civilizations find new hearts ready to listen. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, sleep well and dream of the voices that time cannot silence.